Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Emma Bergesser. I'm the International Anniversary Coordinator at WILPF, and I'd like to warmly welcome you to this very special episode of our Women's Power to Stop War webinar series, Translating International Law to Grassroots Activism. So I'm just going to quickly take you through a few things you need to know, and then I'll hand you off to Barbara and Vanessa. So first, some technical stuff. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the webinar format, it's okay that we can't hear you. That's the way the program works. As long as you can hear me now and maybe see my screen and maybe my webcam, then all is working fine. There will be time for you to ask questions at the end. You can do that by clicking your little hand button on your screen. I will explain again when we get to that. For now, if you have any technical questions that you want me to answer during the webinar, you can try to type it into the question part on your control panel, and I will try to answer it for you. Also, just to let you know, we are recording this webinar like our previous webinars, so make sure you keep that in mind if you do ask a question. So that's for the technical stuff. Just very quickly, for those of you that are completely unfamiliar with us, with WILPF, we are the oldest women's peace organization in the world, which means we work on issues like human rights, to disarmament, to ongoing peace negotiations and food security and about everything else you can imagine. And we have been doing that for almost 100 years now. In short, what we try to do on a daily basis is integrate issues of peace and security with women's human rights. We're a membership organization with over 30 sections around the world filled with our members. So yeah, that's just to give you an idea of what WILPF is. And so then why we are doing this webinar series. So in exactly 1 day and 1 year from now, we will be turning 100 years old, meaning in 1915, over 1,300 women came together in protest of World War I in The Hague. That was the first time, such a big group of women had ever come together internationally on an issue of peace and security, because it was obviously thought it was a man's issue. And so they founded our organization there. So to celebrate that, we have launched Women's Power to Stop War, which aims to connect, strengthen, and celebrate the work of women peacemakers all over the world, and will culminate in our major international conference on peace and security from a gender perspective in April 2015 in The Hague. So this series is a part of those efforts, and hopefully from this month on, we will be holding them monthly, building up to the events in 2015. And then just my last bit, for those of you that have been paying close attention, this is a very special webinar because it's actually in honor of our 99th anniversary, which is exactly tomorrow. So we're very happy about that. Not only does it mean that we have worked for peace for 99 years now, but it also marks the countdown, our 1 year countdown to our 100th. So to mark that, tomorrow two things are happening, two big things are happening. The first is we're launching our anniversary atlas, our long anticipated anniversary atlas. This is, as you can see on the screen, it's a huge timeline spanning from 1915 until 2015, putting on the map all the work that WILPF has done over these last 100 years. And the nice thing is that it shows our major historic events, but also our current and upcoming events. So that is launching tomorrow. The Atlas will also be open for events for our for other organizations, for partner organizations that are part of Women's Power to Stop War. So you can start submitting your events for the Atlas also from tomorrow on. So we encourage you to have a look. And the second major thing that's happening tomorrow is that the conference ticket registrations will launch, meaning you can start booking your tickets tomorrow for 2015 if you know you're coming. So I highly recommend that you do that. There's a great early bird discount for you. And for all the WILPF members listening, the Congress registration opens as well. So you can start planning your trips and start booking. All right, so that's it for me. Now I'm going to hand you over to the fantastic Barbara Chudzinowska. She is the coordinator of the WILPF Academic Network, and she will tell you a bit about the network and its members. And then we'll hand you off to Vanessa. So, Barbara, you have the floor.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar hosted by the Academic Network of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. My name is Barbara, and I have the pleasure to coordinate this network. So I will just say a few words about it. So the Academic Network is a think tank that addresses issues of gender, peace, and security, and gathers scholars from various geographical locations who have different expertise on diverse topics within the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I previously presented to you the members of the network, so today I will just concentrate on 3 new members. So if we could please proceed to the slide with 3 new members. Yes, thank you. So Aisling Sveine is the Associate Professor of Practice of International Affairs at the George Washington University, and she's interested in women's security and development issues. She wrote extensively on national action plans on women, peace, and security. Amy Barrow is an Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Her research interests focus on gender and law within the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and she is a very active member of WILPF 1325 working group. And Laurie Cohen is an independent historian. She graduated at Yale University and received her PhD at the University of Vienna. She's interested in women's peace movements in the first half of the 20th century. And we are very happy that they agreed to join our network and would also like to use the opportunity to welcome them. As for our previous webinars, if you are not able to join the webinars with Cynthia and Law and Joy on Asia, you can see them now on the slide. They were both recorded and are available online, so you can see them anytime you wish. And today our special guest is Vanessa Farr. Vanessa is a feminist freedom fighter. She's been a member of WILPF for many years. She is an independent consultant with impressive experiences of working within the UN system. She was the first global gender and conflict advisor at the UNDP's Bureau for Crisis Prevention and then Social Development, and gender advisor in the UNDP's program of assistance to the Palestinian people. She's now working on the gender impacts of conflict, women peace building, and women governments. And she specializes in Africa and the Middle East. She will be speaking from South Africa, so now I give the floor to Vanessa.
Good morning and welcome to the WILPF 99th anniversary webinar entitled Feminist-Inspired Resistance, which I'm also calling a call to action. I thought I would start this webinar by talking a little bit about the history of the United Nations and how it became involved in promoting gender equality, because this is really important for us to understand in terms of how we can place our activism in the contemporary moment as we head towards WILPF's centenary anniversary next year in 2015. The UN Charter, after the Second World War, is the first international instrument that we have that refers to the human rights and equal rights of both men and women. And what it compels UN member states to do, because they're legally bound, is that all human beings should have the full realization of their rights and their fundamental freedoms. The goal of equality between women and men at that point is elevated in the world from being an ethical issue to actually being a contractual obligation of all governments and the United Nations itself. By the 60s, however, it was becoming quite clear when the International Bill of Human Rights and other related human rights treaties have been set up that the rights are not actually being properly guaranteed to women. And so the Congress on the Status of Women takes this up as an intensive project that it works on between the 50s and 60s. And the interesting international context for this is that, of course, in the 50s and 60s, international human rights was being particularly examined in countries undergoing decolonization processes, which I think is going to become important for where we are in our activism. So the first step in setting up this what would become a set of conventions around women's rights is that women activists inside and outside the UN began to mobilize. This is in the 60s, so those of you who are in Western countries will remember that this was also the second wave of the so-called second wave of modern contemporary feminism, when there was a very big women's rights movement in many of the P5 countries, particularly in the UK, and also in France, in the United States, and obviously in Canada, and Australia and South Africa and places like that, where lots of work was being done to promote women's rights. The General Assembly agreed in December of '63 that a new draft could be prepared, a draft declaration for an instrument that would protect women's rights. And by '65, work had started on this. And then a first declaration on the elimination of discrimination against women was adopted by the General Assembly. And already those controversies that are going to dog CEDAW when it comes to being and are problematic for us as activists today have appeared. And the first of these was Article 6, which speaks about equality of women and men in marriage and the family, and Article 10, which speaks about women's rights to equal employment. And a big debate was going on in the United Nations. Should the General Assembly call for the abolitions of customs and laws that perpetuated discrimination against women? Or should they work more humbly, perhaps, for modification and change in those kinds of discriminations? And those of you working on women's rights today will recognize this as an ongoing dilemma that we still face. By 1972, the CSW was ready to call for a binding treaty, and it took 3 more years until 1979 for the language to be drafted and debated, which, as you can imagine, was a very intensive period. And those of you who've worked on any sorts of declarations or any sorts of mutually agreed or universally agreed instruments will know that debate around what language you can and can't use is very, very difficult, and often has this tendency to reduce everything to a common denominator that everyone agrees on, but that makes it pretty much useless as an advancing human rights instrument. So a very delicate balance was struck. But by September 1981, only 30 days after the 20th member state ratified this very controversial convention, it entered into force. Interestingly, faster than any other human rights convention, but never less than controversially. And those initial controversies that DDAR had already started to pick up on, equality in marriage, equality in family, equality in the workplace, have become very, very, very much more advanced and intense by the time that it's ratified. And indeed, I think have worsened till today. One of the important activist responses to the fact that countries can sign CEDAW with reservations is that women activists have organized themselves around the equality without reservation movement. But one of the things that I think we should be paying careful attention to is I don't believe that in the world that we live in today, with the kinds of right-wing religious agendas that we're seeing, that we would actually be able to negotiate a CEDAW at all. So from that perspective, I think it is a particularly precious and important document, and one that we really need to think of very, very carefully in our work as activists working to end women's insecurity in warfare and to end warfare itself. So where does the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, or I like to call it the WPSA for short, where does that come in? CEDAW, as you all know, makes significant provision for ending violence against women and does a lot of work to really think through what violence against women is, which the feminist movement by the 80s had quite well named and documented. But interestingly enough, it's silent on war violence. It's silent on the particular ways in which women in warfare actually start to face particular kinds of violence, and as we've seen in recent years, sexualized violence as a very significant form of the violence that women face. This omission began to be remedied in the Beijing meeting in 1995, and the platform for action that emerges from that World Conference does for the first time speak about the specific circumstances in which women in conflict zones find themselves. And I think that's a pretty good time to say that the contemporary Women, Peace and Security agenda is launched around that time, because activists inside and outside the UN really started to focus quite carefully on the Women, Peace and Security agenda then. I think it's really important to remember that the international humanitarian law and human rights framework is provided for us by CEDAW. And something that I am quite concerned about in Women, Peace and Security work is that it has become more and more possible for people to divorce the Women, Peace and Security agenda, or what we might call the 1325 agenda, from the human rights agenda. And I think part of my call today is to remind everyone that we've got CEDAW, and that CEDAW is in fact still the place where the best elimination of discrimination language and protocols exist, and that we should really be using that in our work. Something else that I think is really interesting is that even though 5 years of work had taken place between 1995 and the passage in 2000 of Resolution 1325, which is the very first in our series of Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security, that this missing link between conflict and development or de-development that is already visible in CEDAW omitting references to war violence continues. 2000 is the year in which the Millennium Declaration of 2000 is the year in which the missing link between 2000 is the year in which the Millennium Declaration is passed, and it does not reference conflict. It says nothing about what happens to development and what one's potential development aspirations can be in a conflict zone. And here I'm using Sarah Roy's brilliant formulation when she writes about Gaza. She speaks of de-development, in other words, the reversal of development gains made because of ongoing conflict. So the Millennium Declaration is silent on conflict and war-related violence, and then oddly enough, when Resolution 1325 is passed in October, it is silent on development goals. And I think we need to think about why those two pieces of work are not speaking to each other, and how we can overcome that in the post-2015 agenda, where activists have been very clear that they do want reference to war violence and its terrible impacts on development to be included in any new set of development goals that we might as a global community begin to debate and agree. So 2000, as you know, as I've said a few times, of course, is when our wonderful Resolution 1325 gets passed. And it's very, very much a feminist, activist-imbued Security Council resolution. In fact, to date, it is still the only resolution that was brought through public activism, through a social movement, global social movement of women. And it has a very strong agenda, which we call the 3Ps agenda. It talks about prevention of sexualized violence and other forms of violence against women in conflict. It talks about the protection of women from such forms of violence when they can't be prevented. And crucially, it talks about how women can participate in the peace and security agendas, from which women, of course, are very, very much excluded. So the sexualized war, the need to end sexualized war violence had, of course, become extremely visible to us because of long ongoing conflicts in places like Darfur, Sudan, Congo, Liberia, Colombia, and Georgia, many of which are characterized by high levels of sexualized violence and definitely by the exclusion of women. The participation agenda that 1325 lays out remains, to my mind, a quite radical agenda to this day, because it talks about women taking leadership roles in peacemaking. It talks about women being active in conflict prevention. It also talks about desperately needing to include and increase the number of women in all peacekeeping operations. And there's one tiny line in 1325 about how women can take roles in disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or DDR programs, which the feminist community, failing any other language on small arms at that point, I think has used quite cleverly to focus very explicitly on the disarmament processes and agendas that we need to have around the world, which, as you'll know, is one of WILPF's founding principles. So almost 100 years, 90 years or so after WILPF was originally founded as an organization to end militarization and to enable disarmament around the world, 1325 gives us this tiny little gap where we can talk more carefully about disarmament. And I think a lot of us who've been working on this have really taken that gap and exploited it carefully. And you'll see in a short while in this presentation how it, I think, underpins the language that we were able to negotiate for the Arms Trade Treaty of last year. Then there's an HO hiatus, interestingly enough. The Security Council doesn't look at women, peace and security again, and everybody who has been instrumental in the passage of 1325 is now on the ground trying very, very hard to implement this Security Council resolution, to look at it as a critical set of tools, to develop the tools around the implementation of this, and to work out what it is that we can actually do to advance that 3Ps agenda. Then in 2008, in the midst of a massive increase of sexualized violence against women in many of the conflict zones around the world, the Security Council once again looks at this issue, and Resolution 1820 is passed, which focuses very much on sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict situations. I personally have some challenges with this resolution, partly because it was passed in 2008, which was when President Bush was still in charge of the United States with his militarized and very conservative agenda around women. And you won't be surprised to notice that the participation agenda that's so important in 1325, in other words, the inclusion of women in all aspects of decision-making around peace building and disarmament and post-war reconstruction, is very much sidelined or underestimated in this. And yet around the world, conflicts are intensifying. Instances of sex and gender-based violence in conflict are intensifying. Militarization is growing, and one of the parts of the world where we see this is in the Arab uprisings, which, while they're characterized by a very deep urge towards democracy and inclusion, social inclusion, in the countries in which they happen, very quickly become turned into an excuse for increased militarization and increased military violence. One of the things that we've learnt by the time 2008 rolls round is that women's exclusion from decision-making is something that is more difficult when there is a strong women's movement. And this is definitely seen in Liberia, where, as you will know, if you've been following that conflict, there was a very, very powerful women's movement in exile, led by people like Lema Gbowie, who subsequently became a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And that women's movement was very, very important in making sure that Liberian women were not as heavily excluded from that peacemaking process as they probably would otherwise have been. The other place in which we saw interesting developments was when there was strong international feminist support. And I think Sudan, the peace process that started in Sudan around 2005, is a very good example of that, where feminists were working very hard inside the UN to transmit messages from Sudanese feminist activists on the ground about how women were participating, where women wanted to be in those peace talks. And we actually got some language inside the Security Council resolutions passed to enable the peacekeeping operation in Sudan. That meant that for the first time in the history of the world, the demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration process that that country went into had provision for all of those women, those many, many hundreds of women who had actively participated in the country's very long conflict. And I think, again, I'm just going to highlight this as something important for us to remember as we move forward. Strong feminist movements in the country or in exile from the country in conflict, strong international feminist solidarity definitely make a difference in how women can mobilize and organize themselves. The next resolution is 1888, and later in 2000, and it talks again about the prevention of and response to conflict-related sexual violence. And once again, the agenda of women's participation in decision-making and leadership is actually not supported and not advanced. And what we're seeing in the real world at this stage is that formal peace processes are continuing to exclude women. So 1325's agenda on participation and the inclusion of women in formal peace processes has by 2009 not even begun to be realized. Simultaneously with this, however, there's a kind of growing debate in the security world about the role of security sector reform, which is beyond just demobilization and looking at how police and military structures are created in countries, who goes into them, what role they have in keeping peace or indeed in making war. And we're also having a very interesting conversation around the world about small arms and light weapons, their proliferation since the Cold War, their ease of access to civilians, and the gendered consequences of these prolific weapons. So feminists, I think, by 2009 have begun to be much more wide in the way that we want to look at the women, peace and security agenda, and we're moving very much into these hardcore technical areas on who owns guns, who misuses them, what the consequences are of that. So I think we've begun to become quite sensitive to places of exclusion, and we've begun to exercise a much broader kind of an agenda than possibly we imagined we could do with the passage of 1325. I think it's not unimportant that we've become very much more technical and very much more creatively thinking out of the box on how we can talk about security by 2009. So even though I think there's an agenda inside the Security Council and in the General Assembly and in the world at large to go back to women as victims language, inside the feminist security movement, we're actually making a big difference by looking at hardcore security issues. In other words, refusing the assignment of a role that says we are only victims. 1889, which was passed later in 2009, focuses a lot on post-conflict peace building and tries to set up a series of indicators by which we can measure whether women are in fact being included in more central and in more leadership roles. And it also insists that the protection of women and the empowerment of women, whatever that word might mean, because for me that's a bit of a vague word, must be taken into account during post-conflict needs assessment and planning. So in other words, when the United Nations sends a security delegation or a peacekeeping operation into a conflict zone to try to work on the transition out of conflict that everyone is hoping for, that in fact women will be better included. In other words, going back to what we asked for in 1325. Although here again, I think the language is a bit vaguer and a bit less substantial than we had in 1325. So I still see this as being part of that sort of backlash that we're experiencing after 2000. The next resolution that we get in this now unfolding agenda is 1960, which was passed in 2010. And here again, it looks very technically, I suppose, at institutional tools to combat impunity. So the emphasis on sexualized violence in conflict is again back on the agenda. And looking at how you can report on sexualized violence even in the middle of a conflict, looking at whether there is a possibility of prohibition of people who use sexualized violence, looking at punishment, in other words, ending cycles of impunity, are all really important things that 1960 tries to look at. But remember that by 2010, I think we're in this sort of death grip of neoliberalism around the world. And it seems to me that this emphasis on women as victims, women as the victims of sexualized violence in conflict, women as experiencing very particular forms of suffering in conflict, is a two-edged sword, partly because there isn't really anyone on earth who would argue that violence against women is a good thing, even though they might condone it. You would have difficulty, I think, finding even a conservative nation saying, yes, we think that women should be raped in war. No one's going to say that. But by agreeing that women are particularly victimized in conflict, what worries me is that there's a tendency to get rid of, yet again, to really further diminish the participation and leadership aspects that we've been asking for in terms of how are women part of the solution? How can women end war, as WILPF is asking in its centenary celebration? And really by 1960, Resolution 1960, the participation agenda is gone. So I'm just flagging here that I personally have problems with an overemphasis on just looking at women as victims of armed conflict. And as you'll see in the Arms Trade Treaty later, one of the ways in which this is achieved is by constantly saying women and children, which I think is neither helpful to women who are enfranchised adults in most countries on earth, or helpful to children who are, of course, not enfranchised, are young and are in need of specific and particular forms of protection that they should get, even if they're not, even though, although they're not adults. But putting women and children together, for me, diminishes the power of women's leadership and diminishes the power of the argument that children need particular forms of protection in conflict. Resolution 2106, which comes up in the beginning of 2013, once again goes back to the issue of accountability of perpetrators of sexual violence in conflict. And it's what it's trying to do is establish that chains of command chains of command, and the commanders themselves should in fact be held accountable for giving orders or for condoning, not for actively resisting the use of sexualized violence. The problem is that by 2013 we're already seeing that then in some of the long ongoing conflicts in the world, like the one in East Congo, which is over access to resources, that what we're actually seeing in that is men in armed groups are now starting to much more deliberately use sexual violence. And in fact, we're seeing an increase in the kinds of atrocities that women are exposed to. And one of the conclusions that feminists draw from this is that armed groups have realized that this is a good way to get the attention of the world that you're actually craving through your military action. So I think you can see here perhaps the next phase of my criticism about always focusing on sexual violence, and how do women become instrumentalized when that overemphasis on sexual violence is there. But in 2106 we also see women's political and economic empowerment making a theoretical return. And as you'll know from your CEDAW, political and economic empowerment are very strongly CEDAW concepts, and so we're starting, I think, to see a kind of an alignment of the agenda of CEDAW and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And yes, as I was saying, this instrumentalization of violence against women stuff has become very problematic and very visible in the world. You'll remember that one of the loud voices that was heard around justifying the Allies' invasion of Afghanistan was that we must go in and rescue women. And then similar conversations were heard in Iraq. Darfur was very much about combating sexualized violence and the mass rape of women by Janjaweed and other sort of armed opposition groups or government-supported opposition groups, whoever they are. And Libya, for me, was a pretty outstanding example of how the global community can come together and use supposed incidences of violence against women as a reason to go in and take out a dictator, in the case of Libya with Gaddafi. I don't know whether you remember that there was this whole big controversy that arose when there were allegations of mass rape by Gaddafi troops, and Susan Rice in the US, as well as Hillary Clinton, came out quite vocally and said that Viagra-fueled rape was one of the reasons why the NATO bombardment of Libya should be justified. As a result, NATO did go in and they did very heavily bomb Libyan installations, such as police and army barracks, etc. But when Libya was liberated, or when Gaddafi was dead, the first troops who arrived on the ground from outside the country realized that there had not been mass rape campaigns in truth. Gaddafi had been using sexualized violence to terrorize the people, but he'd been doing that for the full period of his dictatorship, and those in the West who knew about it didn't seem to find it interesting then to do anything about the fact that he terrorized his population through sexual violence. And what actually happened was that important security installations in Libya, such as police stations, were destroyed in that aerial bombardment that NATO used. And what's happening now to Libyan women on the ground is that it's even harder than it was before to feel a sense of security. Indeed, in parts of the country in the south, people's insecurity has massively increased since the demise of Gaddafi. So indeed, as we see in Afghanistan, this emphasis again on rescuing women can very much be, I think, seen also as a kind of neo-colonial agenda, where basically it is possible to see that national sovereignty is violated by outsiders who don't necessarily understand the circumstances on the ground and are not working to support the women's movements that are emerging in these countries. So I think that there's a double-edged sword around this that we should be paying very careful attention to in our analysis of what works in the women, peace and security agenda and what does not. By the end of 2013, we have Security Council Resolution 2122, which I am quite excited about because I think it's the first resolution since 1325 that gets back to the spirit of what we were saying in 1325. And what it's doing is it's saying, why are we not seeing a systematic approach to the implementation of the 1325 commitments on women, peace and security? It also concretely tries to look at measures of development, and it also is again very concerned with the deployment of technical expertise in peacekeeping operations and UN mediation teams. In other words, saying we must get experienced women into mediation teams. We must get women who are experienced in diplomatic negotiations into these teams. It's also, and I think this is really important for our agenda as researchers, it talks about the need for improved access to information and analysis on how conflict is actually affecting women on the ground, and looking at what information and data we might have by now 13 years into or after 1325 on how women are participating in conflict prevention and resolution, how that's being reported, how that's going into briefings to the Security Council. So there's a very big and a very strong, to my mind, research agenda that's endorsed by 2122, and that's particularly supportive, I think, of those of us who've been trying to argue that even though the circumstances in which you find yourself in a conflict make it very difficult to collect data that will be agreed on as reliable, we shouldn't stop doing it. And we do, in fact, have a lot of information that we can use now that shows whether the 1325 agenda is working or not. It also is a resolution that talks very strongly about consultation and inclusion of women in peace talks. And for those of you who've been watching the terrible unfolding tragedy in Syria, you'll know how deeply important this is, because Syrian women have been so vocal and so connected into debates around how to make their voices heard, how to ensure that there are women in any Syrian peace process or talks that might at some point unfold. 2122 also revisits the thorny issue of funding, because what we know by now is that while there might be a lot of rhetoric around the inclusion of women, there is very little, any money to concretely do that, and perhaps 1 or 2% of all budgets is going to women's activism. So there's a very important call in 2122 to look properly at budgets, to do a kind of gender budget analysis, and to make sure that the resources women need to be participants are in fact being made available to them. Something that I'm kind of interested in 2122 as well is a little reference to access to healthcare. And I think this is one that we should look at quite closely, because I wonder whether this is also including termination of pregnancies or abortion in cases of rape. And that's a very thorny issue, as you know, because the world, some of this neoliberal conservatism that we're seeing around the world is playing out in the increasing agendas of the kind of right-wing evangelical movement in the Christian world to end abortion, to disallow women to control their own fertility, including when they have a pregnancy that they don't want. So does 2122 give us space to really talk about the termination of pregnancies in cases of war-related rape? Does it open some doors in particularly conservative countries for us to look at this issue of unwanted children born of rape who possibly become part of the conflict cycle because they're abandoned or ill cared for by mothers who didn't want them and who are deeply, deeply traumatized by how these children were conceived? I don't know. I'm just asking that as a kind of follow-up question for anyone who's interested. And another thing that I find very important about 2122 is that it says, yes, we must look at sexualized violence, we must look at rape, but it isn't everything. It is not everything. Women's participation in leadership, women's participation in peacemaking, peace building, negotiations remains our truly important focus of our work. I won't talk very much about the Arms Trade Treaty, because those of you who had the privilege to listen to Joy Onyese of WILPF Nigeria will have had a whole seminar on this, a webinar on this. But just to quickly reiterate that work that started in after 1325, where feminists really began to interrogate the exclusion of women from the growing social movements around ending prolific small arms and light weapons, that language comes up in very, very important ways in the debate leading up to the passage of the Arms Trade Treaty. And we managed to get, I think crucially as an international human rights activist campaign, some language into the Arms Trade Treaty, specifically around reducing the risk of violence to women and to children. Unfortunately, the women and children grouping couldn't be avoided here. But the language in the ATT is gendered. And that is a really, really significant political achievement, and I think gives us another pillar of activism around which we can really work now. The other amazing thing that happened last year in 2013 was our wonderful CEDAW committee, who have been just working very closely with WILPF to understand the ways in which the women's human rights cannot be advanced in war settings, or are likely to be set back by armed conflict. A new General Recommendation, number 30, was passed by the CEDAW Committee, and it is very, very clearly interested in aligning CEDAW and 1325. It talks about the prevention and responses of violence against women in conflict and post-conflict settings, but puts it within that broader CEDAW agenda of ending violence against women. It talks about women's access to justice, which, as we all know, is particularly complicated in transitional and post-conflict moments, and indeed during conflict. And it once again goes back to those two central tenets of CEDAW, that women have the right to equality in political participation and to equality in economic participation. It highlights the need for concerted, integrated approaches to the Security Council agenda on women, peace and security, and the implementation of CEDAW more broadly. And it makes CEDAW more relevant to states that aren't parties to the convention, such as the USA and Sudan. And it also, I think, opens up CEDAW again to territories that don't have official status, such as the occupied Palestinian territory. Another very, very crucial thing, and those of you who've been monitoring the war in Goma and the role of M23, the post-genocide Rwandan-backed armed military group in that part of the world that's been so gruesome towards women, is that the connection of CEDAW and the Women, Peace and Security agenda means that we reach beyond only governance bodies and all groups, in other words, not just governments who've signed up to CEDAW, but all groups participating in conflicts. In other words, independent armed groups or militaries or paramilitaries can all be held accountable for war rapes against women. Another thing that I think is really crucial about the passage of General Recommendation 30 is that one of the spin-offs of the Arab uprisings has been that in countries where very religiously conservative governments have been installed, and again Libya comes to mind, there's been a great deal of rhetoric at government level about how CEDAW is evil and a Western imposition and that human rights are not in fact universal. And there's been some threats that have been made by new governments or by people supporting new religious right agendas that CEDAW can be de-ratified, which in fact it can't be. So again, to get back to my point about we would not be able to get CEDAW passed today. Similarly, all those countries that in 1981 ratified it, even with reservations, no new government can reverse that decision. So for activists working on the 1325 agenda, creating national action plans or whatever it is that they may be doing, in countries where CEDAW has become increasingly difficult to work around because of right-wing backlash, I think this gives new strength to the agenda of you can use 1325 perhaps in ways that you can't use CEDAW, but the General Recommendation 30 makes it very clear to all our activists that we work with at WILPF that CEDAW, which they know and work very hard with, is something that is really, really crucially a part of their 1325 work. And I find that a very encouraging thing. So where does it leave us? It seems to me we have four very, very powerful instruments at our disposal now. 1325 and 2122 as the two Security Council resolutions that I think are really, really important. The Arms Trade Treaty and its inclusive language about the gendered impacts of arms transfers. And, of course, General Recommendation 30. I call these four a kind of pillars, part of the call to action. I think the new recommendation from CEDAW explicitly connects women's human rights, and the Arms Trade Treaty explicitly connects all of these together. I think it creates even further opportunities to connect adolescent girls and women and their human rights goals with a proper analysis of and discussion of the effects of all forms of armed violence as ways in which those human rights are reversed or stopped. And I think it really deeply connects us into much older feminist activist work, where feminists have been very clever at looking at the continuums of violence on which women live, that, from domestic violence in our own homes to violence in schools, violence in the workplace, street harassment, all these other forms of violence that are mobilized against women. And saying that war violence indeed is actually only a really extreme iteration of the kinds of violence that women are subjected to in our lives, everywhere in our lives. So I think we can really go back to that feminist work on the continuums of violence that we live on and look at armed violence much more strategically as part of this much bigger patriarchal agenda, capitalist agenda, to expropriate and exploit and violate women. I think 2013 and those two new instruments that we got, that I connect very strongly with those two earlier instruments, really gives us an opportunity for renewed solidarity and activism. Because one of the things that I've been concerned about as a feminist working on peace and security is that those of us who are fortunate enough to live in countries that are not at war may sometimes, I think, have problems empathizing with women who are in war settings. I think that there can be a tendency to have a kind of colonialist mindset to see that all wars happen in Africa or all wars happen in the Arab states, to possibly have racist tendencies when we think about how these wars are happening over there. And what the Arms Trade Treaty and what General Recommendation 30 give us is an opportunity to turn that spotlight on the arms-producing nations, and from a position of very humble solidarity to say, well, I'm Swedish, for example. and I live in a country that exports arms. And so the impacts on women's lives in Congo becomes something that I, as a Swedish activist, can also talk about. I can shine the spotlight on my government's activities. This, I think, opens huge opportunities for feminists, particularly in the world superpower in the United States, to look very, very carefully at the impacts of American aggressive policies in the rest of the world. For example, it seems to me that our next big field of work has to be around ending robots, military robots, or drone strikes, which are becoming increasingly technocratic, and it's soon going to be possible for a functionary sitting in Washington, D.C. to push a button and drop a drone in a village in Yemen without any pilot, without any human being there. The drones will, or the robots, the killer robots, will make the decision of who needs to be taken out. And for me, that's a very, very scary new frontier in again, technologically removing death and weapons from human activity. But I think, again, that's a point that can be taken up in the arms-producing world, which is the rich world, which is importing, of course, these forms of death to the poor world. I'm wondering whether we can, in our shadow or our alternative CEDAW reports, then become much more proactive about reporting on our country's activities as arms dealers. So, for example, UK WILPF, feminist activists hanging out in Britain, can, in their CEDAW reports, not only look at their government's agenda to massively fund examining the ends of, or supporting the ending of sexualized violence in conflict, but critically look at the ways in which Britain's own military export policies counter this goal. So it seems to me that if you're doing your CEDAW report in a country not at war, you can say something very important about how your country's policies are affecting women in other parts of the world. And I hope that this means that we have another opportunity to look at our own racism and to look at the divides between rich and poor. And indeed to look at the divides between women activists around the world, to say, in what ways do we actually, can we find new forms of solidarity? How can we move through all these complicated things that continue to divide us as very, very diverse women? How can we overcome accusations from the poor part of the world that people in the rich world take over and dictate the agenda? How can we advance our own commitment to global solidarity and really populate WILPF's call to women to examine women's power to end war from a very humble and a very unified approach. So again, a very difficult thing to do, something that, as you'll know, the feminist movement globally has struggled with, but something that I think these new tools give us a greater opportunity to work with. I'm going to stop this recording there right now, and I'm going to go and have a look at the questions that were asked of me, and I'm going to try to address these. So I'll be back. Hi everyone. I'm now having a look at the questions that were asked during the open mic period at the end of the webinar on Sunday. The first question is, what are the concrete things we can do right now at the local grassroots level around the advancing of the women, peace and security agenda? I think there are lots of things that we can do. Following up on my comments about people living in peaceful parts of the world and people living in conflict-ridden parts of the world, I would suggest that WILPF chapters make sure they've got very strong connections with people in war zones, so that we can get information out and we can amplify it. In other words, if you are working from the United States or Sweden, how would you concretely support women working in Congo, who've got very limited access to internet, have difficulty perhaps getting out information? So look again at possibilities for solidarity. The second thing is, as you know, military production and the amounts of money made by the military are shrouded in secrecy, and civil society really is not supposed to know very much about how the military-industrial complex works. So perhaps take it upon yourself, if you're in a country that exports arms, to find out what more about where they're exporting them to, who the end user agreements are being made with, how much money is being made, and you can maybe compare that with your country's development budget, your international development budget. And I would suggest that you go and have a look at what Reaching Critical Will, WILPF's project Reaching Critical Will, is doing, because that might be a good place to get more information. I would also suggest that another practical thing you can do is go and have a look very closely at General Recommendation 30. What is it calling on us to do? How does it realign our peace and security activism work with CEDAW? What kinds of information can you put out in which you challenge the right-wing backlash against CEDAW and make sure that everyone that you work with understands that when you're working on women, peace and security, you're always also working on women's human rights. So the next question was, when will international organizations catch up to local organizations, local NGOs that are already using the Security Council resolutions? That's a pretty hard one to handle, and I think what's always difficult when you work in both international, well, when you try and translate your local grassroots activism into international agendas, is that, of course, the international stuff is so often so arcane, and it's such a removed from, so sort of divorced from what women are doing on the ground, that it can be quite hard to align those agendas. This is one of the reasons why I think we should use 2122 to really forge solidarity around research, where those of us who have perhaps more access to money or more access to good research facilities can feed information back to those who are really struggling in northern Nigeria, for example, to understand what's going on. So NGOs that are already using the Security Council resolutions, 1325 has very much been picked up. National action plans are very much being pushed forward by women's movements around the world. They're an interesting place for solidarity between governments and women's movements, because a national action plan, as you know, requires both governmental buy-in and NGO agreement. So in many parts of the world where 1325 work is advancing, what we've seen is very strong connections being made again between the women's movement and sort of putting the government on notice that you're observing them. Here I'd like to talk about what the Australian feminists did when Australia went onto the Security Council a couple of years ago for the first time ever. Part of the campaign that the Australians used to get themselves into the Security Council was that they said they would advance the 1325 agenda. And there's a group of women in Australia now who formed a kind of watchdog where they monitor what's going on in the Security Council, and they send strongly worded suggestions to their government in Canberra saying, we're watching you and we want to know how you are going to specifically talk to the women, peace and security agenda in everything that you do in the council. So I think everyone who's in a P5 country, here's another practical suggestion, set up a Security Council watchdog role where you actually look at how your country is voting when it's on the Security Council, and whether in fact the decisions that it is supporting or making advance or undermine the women, peace and security agenda. Somebody asked me to read her whole question out loud. One of the points listed on the call for action, which is my call for action, is the need to overcome racism and rich-poor divides. And she says, this is someone writing from France, this is one of the discussions we've been focusing on last week in the Council of Europe, overcoming racism. And she says, but isn't the best route to do this to eliminate the gender row between women? Because women's bodies, women's organizations themselves are divided. We don't have unique voices. We're not on the same page about tackling issues, and there's a continuous struggle between women's groups as a result. It seems to me that this is one of the really radical things about the women, peace and security agenda, because many feminist activists that I encounter in my daily work haven't actually thought beyond women's human rights agendas into all the ways in which insecurity prevents us as women from achieving our human rights. In other words, that sort of divide that I alluded to in my presentation between discourses on development and language on women, peace and security is iterated through us ourselves, through women's groups ourselves. So I think one of the huge roles that we as WILPF, as peace activists who work with WILPF, are undertaking is that we will speak to other women organizing around human rights, organizing around reproductive rights, and so on, to raise the ante, up the ante a little bit on how we can look more carefully at militarization as one of the underlying causes of extreme patriarchal violence and the ways in which women continue to be violated and excluded. So in other words, I think you're right. There is a very significant division between women, and women obviously have very different voices. We shouldn't have to be homogenous. We're very diverse. But perhaps we can all begin to work more clearly, and this is an important goal of the WILPF 100-year celebration, at women's power to end war. How can we be more in solidarity with each other around ending all forms of violence against women, including the violence that's perpetrated with guns in often degraded peacetime settings? I think about what goes on in the Cape Flats in Cape Town, where I live, where prolific small arms are fueling unbelievable violence through gangsters, and solidarity with women in Libya, in southern Libya, who are now being subjected to armed violence because of an increased flow of weapons across the border. And again, getting back to that point I was making about the continuum of violence that feminists have talked about, it seems to me that we can all position ourselves as feminist activists in terms of how we are working on eliminating violence against women, through enhancing our participation, through enhancing our leadership and our knowledge. And I think one of the things that women are very scared of is better understanding militarization. And often, when I speak to women in the field about how they can become part of the demilitarization movement, they say, in our country, you can't ask questions about what the military is doing. I'm in Egypt as I speak today, and here's one of the important points that keeps getting made here in Egypt. You can't know what the military does. You cannot know more about their spending. You cannot know more about their reach of power. They're a kind of no-go area. They're a sort of elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. So again, how do we very consciously engage with women and human rights to also extend their consciousness to looking at militarization? And again, people have pointed out to me that while the Arms Trade Treaty says we must be able to examine the outcomes of exploitation of arms, in fact, most arms exports are shrouded in secrecy. And indeed, that's true. But there are also organizations in the world, such as PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, or CIPRI in Sweden, that are looking at arms production and export around the world. And you can go and have a look at what they've got in terms of what data they've got, relate it back to your country, and see if you can make links that no one wants you to make between an arms deal that France endorsed, for example, and increased gender-based violence in the Central African Republic. What can we surmise when our governments don't want us to know what they actually do with their military spending? So the hiding away of military decision-making from ordinary people is indeed, I think, a very important issue. Okay, I'm just going to stop this recording here.
Hello everybody, this is Emma Bergesser again. I'd like to give a big thanks to Vanessa for being so kind to host this episode, as well as re-record it for this online version. So Vanessa, thanks very much. If you have any questions for Vanessa or the Academic Network, please contact Barbara. Her email's on the screen. If you have any further questions about WILPF or our 100th anniversary, please get in touch with me. I'm also on the screen. And finally, thank you very much for listening in on this webinar. For more information on our series and to watch previous episodes, please have a look at www.womenstopwar.org. Our next webinar will feature around the end of May and will be on sexual violence and armed conflict, hosted by Janie Leatherman. I hope to see you all there. Thanks, everybody.